There's a moment in the Alien franchise that lasts less than 30 seconds. A group of astronauts enter an ancient ship. Inside, they discover a giant fossilized pilot sitting in a chair. Its chest exploded outward. And that's it. There's no explanation, no flashback, and no exposition. The film simply moves on. And somehow, that dead pilot became one of the most iconic images in science fiction. That has always fascinated me. You see, today that scene would probably not exist the way that it does. Someone would surely ask, who was he? Where was he going? What species was he? Where did the eggs come from? Who built the ship? Why was it carrying them? And eventually, someone would answer every one of those questions. Alien never does. And that's exactly why we're still talking about it almost 50 years later. Hello everyone, my name is Falcon and welcome to What Am I Watching? Tonight, I don't want to review the Alien franchise. I want to ask a very different question. When did Alien stop trusting its audience? Because I don't think the series declined overnight. I think something much more interesting happened. One movie at a time, the franchise slowly replaced mystery with explanation. And in doing so, it lost one of the things that made the original so unforgettable. So turn off the lights and stay a while. Let's learn a few things together, shall we? Alien wasn't the first horror movie I ever loved. It was the first horror movie that changed me. It's one of the reasons I became an artist. It made me want to draw, to sculpt, to understand creature design. Later, it became one of the reasons I became interested in filmmaking, because everything about Alien feels deliberate. The lighting, the pacing, the performances, and the sound design. H.R. Giger's biomechanical nightmare, Ridley Scott's direction, and the Nostromo, a character itself. Nothing feels accidental. In my opinion, it's as close to perfection as a horror film can get. And that's a statement I don't make lightly. I am incredibly critical of movies. I don't just watch them. I pull them apart. I look for structural weaknesses, editing mistakes, writing inconsistencies, moments where characters stop behaving like people. Most movies don't survive that process very well. Alien almost does it to perfection. In fact, there's one technical mistake I've ever consistently noticed. The famous shot of the acid burning through the deck of the Nostromo. Well, it's used twice. The exact same footage appears in two different levels of the ship. It's a tiny editing mistake that most people would never notice. I still smile every time I catch it. Somewhere, an editor was probably having a very long day. But then, there's my mother, the writer. Every 6 months or so, she and I somehow end up having the exact same argument. And every 6 months, she makes me a coffee and tells me that Alien does have another flaw. Megs, sometimes the coffee is excellent, and sometimes it definitely isn't. The argument always comes back to the character Ash. When Kane returns to the Nostromo with the facehugger attached to him, Ripley refuses to let the crew back inside. She's following quarantine procedure. Ash overrides her and opens the airlock door anyway. Later in the film, Ripley confronts him, Ash asking her, "What would you have done if you were in my position?" My mother insists this is a writing mistake. Ash already knows what Ripley would have done. She had already refused them entry. So why ask? Honestly, I don't think it's a flaw at all. You see, Ash isn't asking for information. He's performing humanity. At this point in the story, Ash is still pretending to be human. He's trying to justify his decision the way a person might, almost saying, if you were standing where I was, hearing your friends begging to come inside, would you have really left them out there? That's not a question about logic. It's about emotion. And emotion is exactly what Ash has spent the entire film pretending to understand. Maybe I'm right, and maybe my mother is. I'll never admit it, but honestly, that's not the real point here. The point is, we're still debating this line of dialogue almost 50 years after it was written. How many movies inspire that kind of conversation? I think that's because Alien understands something modern horror films forget. Every answer closes a door. Every unanswered question opens one. Take the space jockey, for example. Everything I need to know about that creature I learned from one image. It's ancient, dead. Something burst from its chest. Its ship was carrying something. Eggs. And that's enough. I don't know if it was transporting them, if it was discovering them, if it was running for them and then infested by them. The movie doesn't care, because the mystery is doing something far more valuable than explanation ever could. It's making me participate long after the credits rolled. I kept asking questions. I kept imagining possibilities. I kept building the story in my own head. And that's the genius of Alien. It doesn't just scare you while you're watching it. It recruits your imagination long after it's over. Your mind keeps writing scenes the movie never shows. And no visual effect, no matter how expensive, would ever be as frightening as the vision your own imagination creates. I think that's why Alien still feels timeless. Not because the effects haven't aged, not because it's perfect. Almost nothing in this world is. But Alien endures because it has confidence. Confidence to slow down, to remain silent. Confidence in its audience. Confidence to leave one of the greatest mysteries in science fiction sitting quietly in that chair, without ever explaining who he was. And I think that's where the Alien franchise reached its highest point, because from here on, something begins to change. Not all at once, not even in the next film, but slowly, almost invisible. The series begins making a choice between mystery and explanation. And that single choice would shape every sequel that followed. Here's where I think people expect me to say something controversial. They'll expect me to tell you that Aliens ruined Alien. Oh well, I don't think that it did. In fact, I think that James Cameron understood something incredibly important. He wasn't trying to remake Ridley Scott's film. He changed the genre instead. Alien is a haunted house movie. Aliens is a war movie. And that's exactly why it worked. Imagine if Cameron had tried to recreate the original. One crew, one alien, dark hallways, slow tension. No one would have accepted it. People would have spent the entire runtime comparing it to Ridley Scott's masterpiece. Instead, he asked a completely different question. What happens when humanity comes back? Prepared. It's a brilliant premise. The first crew had no weapons. The second arrived with an army, and somehow they still weren't prepared. That's smart storytelling, not because it repeated Alien, but because it respected Alien enough to become something different. Even the creatures changed. The alien isn't quite mysterious anymore. We've already seen it. So Cameron doesn't try to make the creature scarier. He makes it overwhelming. One alien terrified us. Now, there are hundreds. The fear no longer comes from uncertainty. It comes from the impossible odds. That's an entirely different kind of horror, and it works. The characters deserve just as much credit. Ripley evolves naturally. She's no longer simply surviving. She's protecting someone. Hicks becomes one of the kinds of characters you hope to lead this kind of crisis. Bishop quietly earns our trust. Hudson? Hudson begins as a comic relief, and slowly becomes the audience. Confident, then uncertain, and then terrified. Even the Colonial Marines, despite having a few scenes each, they still feel like people, not because they received enormous backstories, but because James Cameron understood something simple. Character isn't created by exposition, it's created by behavior, and you learn who these people are by watching them work together. That's why so many of them remain remarkable decades later. Personally, Aliens has never been my favorite. I'm not much of an action movie person. I prefer slow psychological horror, tension, silence, and atmosphere. So when I say Alien is a 9.9, and Aliens is an 8. That isn't because I think Cameron failed. Far from it. It's because the genre simply isn't the one I naturally gravitate towards. As a film, I think Aliens succeeds at exactly what it sets out to accomplish. Honestly, that took courage. Turning one of cinema's greatest horror films into an action movie could have been a disaster. And instead, it became one of the greatest action films ever made. That, by itself, is an extraordinary achievement. Then came Alien 3. And this is where conversation usually becomes emotional. Some people absolutely hate this movie. Others defend it passionately. I fall firmly into the second camp. Not because it's flawless, because I think history has been kinder to Alien 3 than audiences were in 1992. First, we have to acknowledge the obvious. Alien 3 went through production hell. Scripts rewritten over and over, time and time again. Directors came and left. Entire concepts were built and abandoned. Fox interfered constantly. David Fincher was making his first film, and somehow, a coherent movie came out the other side. That's remarkable. But here's what truly interests me. Fincher didn't follow Cameron. He followed Ridley. Not stylistically, but psychologically. He brought the film franchise back towards horror. Not the industrial horror of the Nostromo, but gothic horror. A crumbling prison. Religious imagery. Isolation. Guilt, sacrifice, and hopelessness. Alien 3 isn't interested in military victory. It's interested in inevitability. Every character already feels condemned before the alien even arrives. The creature simply becomes a physical manifestation of that hopelessness. One criticism that I've never fully agreed with is that the prisoners aren't memorable. Actually, I think it's quite the opposite. They're murderers, rapists, convicts. On paper, people should struggle to care about them. And yet somehow, as the film progresses, many of them become sympathetic. Not because the movie excuses what they've done, but because it allows them to become something more than their crimes. Several choose sacrifice, others choose courage, and some discover dignity at the very end of their lives. That isn't easy writing. It's just another one of Alien 3's strengths. And then there's the assembly cut. And I almost hesitate to call it a different version, because honestly, it feels like a different film. Entire character arcs change. Major plot shifts. The pacing breathes differently. It's not simply deleted scenes being stitched back in. It's another interpretation of the same story. And strangely, I don't think either version completely replaces the other. There are scenes I prefer in the theatrical cut, and there are scenes that I prefer in the assembly cut. If someone asked me which one they should watch, my honest answer would be to watch both, because together, they tell the story Alien 3 was trying to become before production reality's forced compromise. And how does it hold up today? Well, the only part of Alien 3 that's truly aged for me is the rod puppet. It's fascinating from a filmmaking perspective. Tom Woodruff Jr. and Alec Gillis were attempting to give the alien inhuman movement that a performer inside of a suit could never create. Many people assume those shots were early CGI. Well, they weren't. They were a practical rod puppet composited into the scenes. The intention was brilliant. The technology just... it wasn't quite there. Ironically, the film contains only about 1 second of actual CGI. The scene of the cracking of the dome in the alien's head. A brief, fleeting moment. Everything else is practical craftsmanship. And that's why I still love Alien 3. Not because it's perfect, but because it had something to say. I believe horror can still be tragic. I believe endings don't have to be happy. I believe Alien didn't need to become larger, or louder, or more complicated. It simply needed to remain inevitable. Looking back now, I don't think Alien 3 marked the end of an original trilogy. I think it completed it. 3 films, 3 directors, 3 completely different genres. 1 horror film, 1 action film, and 1 gothic tragedy. And somehow, all 3 still felt like they belonged in the same universe. And that is far more difficult than people often give the trilogy credit for. Unfortunately, this is also where I think something quietly changed. Not on screen, but behind the scenes. Fox looked at Alien 3's disappointing box office and saw a franchise decline. But then, audiences started to look at home video, and they discovered a trilogy that kept finding new fans year after year. The studio once saw uncertainty, but the audience gave it longevity. And when a studio sees a franchise continuing to make money, one question inevitably follows. How do we keep going? I don't think anyone realized it at the time, but that question would fundamentally change the Alien franchise forever. I don't think Alien Resurrection failed because it was weird. Alien has always been weird. I don't even think it failed because it resurrected Ripley, although that certainly requires a very generous suspension of disbelief. I think Resurrection marks the moment the franchise stopped asking, what story deserves to be told? And it started asking, how do we keep the franchise alive? There's a difference. A very important difference. Don't misunderstand me. There are things I genuinely enjoyed about Resurrection. Ron Perlman is endlessly entertaining. The practical creature effects returning are excellent. Jean-Pierre's visual style gives the film a personality of its own. If someone told me they enjoyed Resurrection, I wouldn't argue with them. Movies are subjective, but their storytelling begins making decisions that no longer feel inevitable. They feel convenient. Ripley returns because cloning is suddenly capable of bringing back not only her, but the alien queen growing inside of her. She's now part alien, and the queen is now part human. Then we arrive at the newborn. Beautifully designed, but it's also where I think the franchise crossed an important line. The alien stopped feeling unknowable. It became experimental. Almost as though every sequel now needed to invent a new version of the creature instead of asking whether the creature needed changing at all. The original Xenomorph didn't become iconic because it evolved in every movie. It became iconic because it didn't need to. Then came Alien vs. Predator. Honestly, it's exactly what the movie title promises. And I don't necessarily mean that as a criticism. It exists to answer one question. Who would win? The practical effects are excellent. The creature work is among some of the best in the series. The premise, I gotta say it's kinda fun. But this is also where the universe began adding mythology that feels smaller. And suddenly, predators have been using aliens as hunting rituals for centuries, and ancient civilizations were involved. Human history becomes intertwined with both species. Some people, they like that explanation. But personally, I think every answer shrinks the universe just a little more. One of the reasons Alien felt enormous was that because humanity felt insignificant. And now, everything somehow revolves around us. The universe becomes less mysterious, because it becomes more familiar. And then there's Requiem. Honestly, I don't want to spend any time here, because I don't think there's much to gain. The creature work itself is outstanding. Tom Woodruff Jr. and Alec Gillis continued producing fantastic practical effects. Then unfortunately, the filmmaking surrounding those effects rarely lets them shine. The lighting obscures them. And I get dark lighting, keeping things hidden in the shadows, shapes, and letting our imagination come to conclusions. But this movie looked like it was lit by a single candle. And the characters in this movie? Oh, Jesus, the characters. Everybody felt interchangeable. The story feels assembled rather than written. And perhaps, more importantly, the film mistakes shock for horror. One particular sequence involving a pregnant woman is still one of the most tasteless moments in the franchise. Honestly, in my opinion, it's one of the most tasteless moments in filmmaking. Whoever wrote that scene, shame on you. Not because it's disturbing. Alien has always been disturbing. But it purely exists to provoke. It tells us nothing about characters. It tells us nothing about the creature, and nothing about fear. Only that filmmakers wanted to push boundaries. For me, that's where horror stops being meaningful. But none of these films changed the Alien franchise as much as Prometheus did. Because Prometheus made a decision, and one that I think the series has never fully recovered from. It answered the space jockey. You remember him, right? The giant fossilized pilot sitting silently in the dark on a derelict spaceship. For over 30 years, people imagined who he was, where he came from, why he died. And then Prometheus answered it all. He wasn't a mysterious species anymore. He was, and I hate calling them this, he was an engineer. They created humanity. Humanity killed their version of Jesus. Then the engineers decided we needed to die. And yes, that is the canon. And with all of that, suddenly one haunting image from 1979 became an enormous mythology. You see, here's the problem. I don't actually mind answers, but I do mind unnecessary answers. Because the question was already doing something far more valuable. It was making us imagine. The moment answers arrive, our imagination stops working. The mystery ends. And so does our investment. Ironically, Prometheus creates the exact opposite problem. It explains mysteries no one was asking, while creating dozens of new mysteries it never intended to resolve. And if you've watched Lost, that probably sounds familiar. Writer Damon Lindelof, responsible for Lost and Prometheus's rewriting. Questions piling on top of questions. Answers remain elusive. There's a difference between ambiguity and unfinished storytelling. Alien always understood that difference. Prometheus and Damon Lindelof, they don't. A quick tangent. Anyone who loves the Alien franchise, I implore you to look up the original script for Prometheus. It was actually pretty good. It was such a good Alien film, in fact, that Ridley Scott, in his madness, decided it was too much of an Alien film. And that's where he hired Lindelof to Lindeloficize the script. Anyway, I needed to get that out there. It's easy to Google the script, get your hands on it, and give it a read. It's pretty awesome. Moving on from Prometheus, we follow on to Covenant. Covenant tries to steer the ship back to the Alien franchise, and what it used to be. I genuinely appreciate the effort. There are stronger characters. 3 of them. The atmosphere feels closer. The xenomorph, it returns. But it can't completely escape the story Prometheus already built. Instead of feeling like Alien, it feels like Blade Runner wearing an alien costume. Beautifully directed and wonderfully photographed. Thought-provoking, yet somehow still distant. And after Covenant came Romulus. People saw the trailers, and they raved. They knew they were going to love this one even before it came out. And that's what actually makes me a little sad. Because I can see exactly what the filmmakers were trying to do. They clearly love Alien, and it feels right. The lighting feels right. The practical effects, they feel right. Even the pacing, it often feels right. It remembers the aesthetic, but it doesn't quite remember the philosophy. The biggest problem isn't the alien, or the return of the bloody black goo from Prometheus. It's the people. You never truly care about them, and that's devastating. Because the original trilogy understood something that was fundamental. Alien only matters if the characters do. When a character becomes a blind chess piece, the monster loses its impact. There's also a deeper issue. Romulus wants to reconnect itself to the original film, so it finds Big Chap floating through space. For those of you who don't know, the alien from the first film was dubbed Big Chap by the production crew. An interesting idea at first. But then, that single drone somehow becomes the foundation for an entire research station full of facehuggers. Again, the explanation becomes more important than the internal logic itself. The series tries to answer new questions, even when answering them creates entirely new problems. Drones don't lay eggs. Where the hell did these facehuggers come from? And now? Oh no. Now we arrive at Alien Earth. I genuinely wish I had something more positive to say about this. The practical work remains impressive. The artists clearly cared. But once again, the storytelling mistakes spectacle for substance. Characters make baffling decisions. Development becomes secondary to plot convenience. And the alien itself often feels less like a terrifying organism and more like something waiting for its next scene. Looking back over almost 50 years of filmmaking, I don't think the Alien franchise lost its practical effects. I don't think it lost talented directors. It didn't lose incredible artists, or even lose ambition. It lost confidence. The confidence to remain silent. The confidence to trust its audience. Confidence to leave one dead pilot sitting in a chair, without ever explaining who he was. You see, once horror begins believing that every mystery needs an answer, the audience stops participating. We stop imagining. We stop arguing with our mothers. We stop wondering. And slowly, that fear begins disappearing with it. And that's why I don't believe Alien is nearly a perfect film because of the Xenomorph, or Ripley, or Giger, or the Nostromo. I think it's nearly perfect because it understands something storytellers have been forgetting more and more over the last few decades. The unknown isn't frightening because we don't have an answer. The unknown is frightening because our imagination will always create something far more terrifying certainty ever could. That's why people still debate the space jockey. It's why my mother and I still argue about one line of dialogue 50 years earlier. And it's why, despite every sequel, every prequel and every crossover, every attempt to explain the mythology, when I think about Alien, the first image that comes to mind isn't the Xenomorph. It's the silent pilot, sitting alone in the dark. A question that never needed answering. I want to thank you all for staying as long as you did. If you stayed this long, I must be doing something you like. If you enjoy horror that lingers, consider subscribing. And now I'd love to hear from you. When do you think the Alien franchise changed? Was it after Alien, Alien 3, or Prometheus? Or do you even think it lost its way at all? I'll see you in the comments. And until next time, I hope to see you in the next video. I think it's nearly perfect because it understands something storytelling not storytelling, it's storytellers. Storytellers. I think it's nearly perfect because it understands something storytellers have been forgetting for more and more. There's no 4. Why did I put a 4 in there? The atmosphere feels closer. I feel like I need another coffee.